In today's episode of Dracula, a Reader's Guide, we're going to be looking at the ways that sexuality is represented in the novel. Although Dracula is a far cry from our modern day vampires, where we get romanticised vampires that are very sexual and attractive, there is still an element of all of this within the classic vampire stories like Dracula and also Sheridan Le Fanu's Camilla. Even in these novels, vampires still have a kind of sexual allure and bring out the latent sexuality in the human characters. The difference being that in these classic novels, sexuality is something to be feared rather than something to be desired. In this video, we're going to be looking at three different things. First, we're going to look at how sexuality is represented in the human characters, and I really want to focus on Jonathan Harker and Lucy Westenra. Then we're going to focus on how sexuality is represented in the vampires, focusing of course on Dracula and his three brides as well. And then lastly, we'll explore how these two things relate to each other, and I'll argue that the vampires essentially serve as a way for the human characters to confront the latent sexual desires that they had all along. Part 1. Bram Stoker, Repression and Sexuality. Before we look at how sexuality is represented in the novel, I think we should go back and think about Bram Stoker himself and his own sex life. Although you don't always need to look at someone's biography to understand their novel, I do think that thinking about Stoker and his own sexuality does shed some interesting light on the novel. As I said in the first episode, Bram Stoker did seem to be a sexually repressed man. Stoker's marriage to his wife was largely a sexless one, and he also had friendships with gay men, especially Oscar Wilde, and he also sent amorous letters that could maybe just be, very, very romantic fan letters, or they could be something more, to his idol Walt Whitman. And you can read those letters and judge for yourself what you think of them. Now, this leads some to speculate that Stoker was a gay man. Personally, I don't know if the evidence is conclusive here, but it certainly seems that Stoker had a sexually complicated life, either because he was just Victorian and slightly repressed because of that, or because his sexuality was more complicated. Although Stoker did at one point say that he believed that homosexuality was a sin, this could just be seen as a deflection tactic. It is a sad truth of the times that being homosexual in Stoker's time was not something that you could openly talk about, and in fact many gay men not only would openly pretend to be anti-homosexual, but would even throw other gay men under the bus if it meant protecting themselves. This happened of course to Oscar Wilde, but it's also something that we see in some of the novels of the time and also later. E.M. Forster's Morris is a good example of this. In that novel, the character Morris has a lover, and that lover threatens to expose Morris at one point when they have an argument. So it did seem that this was the sort of thing that used to go on. And in Stoker's case, he did maintain his friendship with Oscar Wilde after Wilde was exposed and exiled for his homosexuality. So it seems like there are conflicting messages again in what Stoker's opinions really were. Personally, I always think it's better to judge someone's actions rather than their words, and so given Stoker's continued association with Wilde after his exile, I would say that his words about homosexuality probably aren't all that sincere. But again, this is pure speculation and something we can debate in the comments. Many people argue that the fear about sex in Dracula is only a fear of female sexuality, as represented by the brides and also Lucy, who are hyper-sexual women. But actually I think there is a lot more going on and a lot more horror in sexuality in this than just focusing on female sexuality. And I'll show this by looking at Jonathan and Dracula and their relationship with each other. And I'll argue that although it is true that Dracula is a novel that seems to be about the horror of sexuality, it goes much further than just horror of female sexuality. Part 2. Jonathan, Dracula and his brides, a love triangle. In the previous episode, we looked at how Stoker combines Radcliffe's gothic terror and Lewis's gothic horror in the first part of the novel, when Jonathan arrives at Castle Dracula and is trapped there. The first switch from terror to horror, I argued, comes in when Jonathan is confronted and in the clutches of Dracula's brides. In this scene, we see a complete reversal of traditional sexual gender roles, as Jonathan becomes a helpless damsel, a prey for the three brides. The idea of vampires as hunters is something that Dracula foreshadows earlier in the novel when he says to Jonathan, "Ah, sir, you dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter." This gender reversal is made most explicit at the end of the chapter when Jonathan falls in a dead faint as the three brides devour an infant, a complete subversion of the maternal role in the most explicit way possible. So as I said before, we have this traditional interpretation of what is going on here, and that is that we have three sexually powerful women and they are presented in a way that is terrifying to the reader. Jonathan is horrified by them, and we, the reader, is also supposed to be horrified by them. And so the interpretation goes that Stoker is trying to tell us that female sexuality is terrible and something to fear. And this, of course, comes from the Victorian sexual values of his time. But I think there could be an alternative interpretation of this, especially in light of what we know about Stoker himself. Firstly, if Stoker really is a repressed gay man, then perhaps these scenes could be better understood as the horror that a gay man feels at the prospect of having to sleep with a woman. After all, it is an expectation of the time for Stoker and other gay men that they should take wives, and this prospect is obviously going to be a horrific one for them. And so it makes sense then that if that is true of Stoker, perhaps that's how he's dealing with that in his story, by having these women come across as monstrous, because the prospect of sleeping with a woman as a gay man is, not a great thing. A second interesting thing, though, to look for in this episode is Jonathan's reaction to the women. Ultimately, he does faint, but this is only at the sight of the three women devouring a baby, which is pretty damn horrific and something worth fainting for. But before Dracula storms in on them, Jonathan has a very different reaction to the bride's advances, a much more ambiguous reaction. "I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed to fasten about my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle, as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart." So the way Stoker describes this makes it seem like Jonathan is, while somewhat terrified, also quite thrilled by what is happening to him. He actually seems to enjoy taking this somewhat feminine or submissive role in the bedroom. Now, it's hard to judge how people would have reacted to this passage, and there is always a tendency when we look at the past, and in particular the Victorians, to just assume that they must have been all outraged and shocked and horrified by it. But I can't help but feel like there is an ambiguity in this passage, and I can't help but feel like Stoker is trying to titillate the reader as much as he's trying to frighten them. Not only is Harker's emotion quite ambiguous as he is sort of enjoying but also terrified by what's going on here, but also the language is deeply sensual. It reads almost like a piece of erotic fiction. It's almost like a fantastical recreation of someone who's enjoying themselves alone, pleasuring themselves, and then they get disturbed and someone comes in and suddenly you feel horrified because you realize what you're doing, you feel shame, and you hide and run away. So the horror in this scene to me isn't just about the horror of female sexuality. Instead, it's the horror of people's own desires. The passage invites the readers to enjoy and to play with what is going on here, and then immediately confront the horror of what they're doing. And that must have been very effective in the Victorian times when people were a lot more oppressed about these things. And what about Dracula and his role in this part of the book, and also just generally his relationship with Jonathan? Well, the reason why I called this part a love triangle is because it seems to me that there is something about Dracula's relationship to Jonathan, or his attachment to Jonathan, which goes beyond the platonic. Consider the following lines as the Count addresses his bride and tells him of his plans for Jonathan. "Then the Count turned, after looking at my face attentively, and said in a soft whisper, 'Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will.'" Here he is describing Jonathan as his property, something to be used as an object, maybe as prey, but maybe also as pleasure. Dracula's actions in this passage, his fury with his bride and his possessiveness over Jonathan, make him come across as a jealous lover. And the last thing that Dracula says to Jonathan in this scene is, "I am in hopes that I will see more of you at Castle Dracula." Now, it could also be that this is just the Count making a cruel joke, because he actually isn't going to see Jonathan ever again. But then, why didn't the brides kill Jonathan? They kept him alive for quite a while. And so it seems like there was some intention to make Jonathan into a vampire, and then there is a question mark around exactly what role he would have in relation to the Count. Would he just share the brides with Dracula? Would Dracula just kill him when he returns? Or would Jonathan become one of his brides as well? A final interesting thought on vampires and how their sexuality is represented in the novel is its connection to hunting. We've already mentioned earlier that Dracula thinks of himself as a hunter, and his brides are described as huntresses as well. And what's interesting about this association is that the actions of Dracula and his brides, on the one hand, can be seen as the actions of someone lusting after another and wanting to consume them in a sexual way, but they can also be seen as the actions of a hunter who is seeking prey and gratification in the way that we all seek gratification from food. And it's interesting that we get this parallel between these two kinds of desire, and they really are indistinguishable from each other. It's hard to say exactly whether Dracula's obsession with any of the women or Jonathan comes from a place of sex or just a need to feed and consume. And this obviously is one of the reasons why I think vampires have this erotic quality to them, because those links between being prey and sexually submissive, or being a hunter and sexually dominant, are all throughout vampire literature. Part 3. Lucy Westenra, Sexuality Unbounded. Perhaps the best exploration of sexual repression in Dracula comes from the character of Lucy Westenra. Lucy is the only character in the novel who goes fully from the transition from human to vampire, and so by looking at her character we can really get a sense of how Stoker sees vampires as being different from humans, and also get a sense for how sexuality changes in these characters when they become vampires. Of course, Lucy does become incredibly sexually assertive when she becomes a vampire, but her desires were already there under the surface when she was a human, and we explore this in the first part of the novel when she is still a human. In one of her early letters, Lucy tells Mina about her 3 suitors, and she declares, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble?" This is referring to the fact that at the beginning of the novel, Lucy has 3 men who all desire her, and she has to pick the one that she wants. And here she expresses her desire that it would be great if she could just have all 3. Now, of course, there is a completely innocent interpretation of this line, but Lucy is no child. She knows what marriage entails, and she knows why you're only supposed to marry 1 man, and yet she still says this line. She knows that marriage will entail sex, and so when she says that if she could have all 3 men, she knows that that would allow her to have sex with 3 different men. And so this to me suggests that she has that desire under the surface. Her desire is not only to have romantic relationships with multiple men, but even to have sexual relationships with multiple men, however dressed up this is in talk of marriage and romance. Now, in a perverse twist, Lucy does kind of get her wish. As Van Helsing tries to save Lucy from Dracula, she is pumped with the blood of all 3 of her suitors, as well as Van Helsing himself. Although perhaps that wasn't the exchange of bodily fluids that she was going for. In Dracula, there is a lot of talk about the world of the unconscious and the world of the conscious, and how these two things relate to each other, especially when people become vampires. When Lucy is dying, Van Helsing makes it clear that Lucy has to die conscious, not unconscious. Unconsciousness is the state in which Dracula and other vampires are able to influence Lucy and anyone else that they desire. And this is what happens to Lucy and later Mina when he comes for them in their sleep. According to Freud, whose work Stoker very likely was aware of, dreams are the state in which one's repressed desires and wishes boil to the surface. No wonder then that Jonathan, Lucy and Mina are all seduced in this dreamlike state, where their sexual desires cannot be fully repressed by their conscious egos. When Lucy becomes a vampire, Van Helsing says this about her current state. "In trance she died, and in trance she is undead too." So Lucy died in this unconscious state in which her repressed desires were all there for the taking, and she continues to be in this state as she is undead. Now Van Helsing and the other men use this distinction between the unconscious and the conscious to basically say that the Lucy who is a vampire isn't really her, because the real Lucy wouldn't desire these things. She wouldn't be sexually assertive in these ways, and she certainly wouldn't be devouring babies. But actually they are wrong to do this. Lucy did have these desires bubbling under the surface. It's just that now that she is in that state permanently, her ego isn't able to censor them. And as a vampire then, all of the unconscious things, all of those perverse desires, all those sexual interests can come to the fore. Of course, there is more to it than this. After all, in Dracula, the vampires are demonic forms, and there is an element of possession and all the typical stuff that you get with vampires also playing a role here. It's not clear that Lucy really wanted to eat babies when she was a human being. That's certainly coming from the fact that she is now a vampire. But Lucy did have some of those sexual desires before. She desired to marry 3 men, and she toyed playfully with that idea before quickly censoring herself. But now, as a vampire, that censoring component of her personality is gone, and we're just left with those primitive urges, completely unbounded. And that is the Lucy that the men are horrified by, and that they think isn't really Lucy. But that's not quite the case. Ultimately, the vampire personality just brings to light those repressed sexual desires of human beings. And this, of course, for Stoker, a sexually repressed man, and his Victorian readers, ultimately horrific. Part 4. Conclusion. The horror of sexuality. Dracula paints a horrific picture of unbridled sexuality. All of the human beings in the story are not especially sexual on the surface, but all of them, whether male or female, have sexual desires under the surface, which the vampires, by their presence, bring out of them. Vampires themselves represent those desires without the voices of oneself or society repressing them. Moreover, this extreme sexuality comes whether you're a male vampire or a female vampire. Both of them have these unbridled desires, and they're unconstrained by anything. And so in a way there's an element of androgyny to vampires as well, because they don't really have the typical gender distinctions that we get when we look at men and women in human form. There's definitely a lot more to say here about gender roles and androgyny in vampires, and so we'll be looking at that in a future episode. But ultimately, all of this stuff about sexuality is horrific in the context of Dracula. Stoker's novel is a novel ultimately against promiscuity and unbridled sexuality. Now, this is either due to the sexual morality of his time, or perhaps his own inner sexual crises, whatever they happen to be. Stoker ultimately believes in the importance of modesty and sexual regulation. Nevertheless, he also seems to be very much aware that even under the veil of regulation and modesty, those naughty little desires are still lurking in that dangerous world of the unconscious. So those are my thoughts on Dracula and how Stoker addresses themes of sexuality and sexual repression in his novel. Let me know down in the comments what you think of anything that I've said in this video, and if you have any additional thoughts on these topics, I'd definitely love to hear those as well. Until next time everyone, take care, ta-ra!